What does poetry mean to me, you ask? Poetry is just an attempt by the lamestream liberal media to try and control the emotions of the uneducated masses or the herd, and I don't appreciate it at all.
Poetry is a unique self-expression of the soul, and it can be interpreted in many different ways.
Poetry is emotion. It doesn't have to do so much with words as it does a common thread of thought, I should say, or a common feeling that is then evoked similarly through other people's different experiences.
What does poetry mean to you, Allison?
Poetry is sort of like distilling words into something more meaningful than just a signifier. I mean, it's like putting emotion and... You don't have to look at me seriously like that.
No, I'm listening to what you're saying.
Yeah, it's sort of a synthesis of emotion and expression in words that often, in everyday conversation and in interviews like this, don't do justice to those emotions and those expressions. I think it is an art, and for me, poetry as an art, it's an important mode of expression. I don't know.
Wow. That was really smart and stuff. Mine's gonna be a lot less vocabulary things happening. I think poetry to me is just an easy way to express the things that I can't in everyday life. Because either, the situations you're in or the people you're around or whatever, you can't always express everything that you want to. And poetry is a way to do that. And also it's very personal and it can be very public too, which I enjoy. I don't really have any other great thoughts there, but...
Yeah, it's interesting to see how, for some poets, it's really like a personal thing, and then they can distance themselves from their work and eventually share it with less immediate emotional response. I don't know. Anyways, that's what other people think, not what I think.
Bye! What is that you do? You sneak.
So, what does poetry mean to you, little girl?
Poetry?
You gotta answer the question.
Okay.
I'm not gonna let you go until you answer.
I won't. To me, it's a lineless, borderless exploration into...
Into what?
Oh gosh, into the unable to be explainable.
Ooh.
What does poetry mean to you?
To me?
Yes, to you. I'm asking you.
Poetry is a window to express yourself in funner ways than you normally would, versus it's like a creative journal.
Is that all?
It's so weird to watch you.
That's most of it, yeah.
This is a test. This is only a test. The question, what is poetry? The answer, I think, has to be roundabout because of the nature of the question. And the question is really, what does poetry mean today? And to begin to answer that question, I think we have to start with the observation that a lot of the language we use, even language that we consider to be literal, is, as a matter of fact, metaphorical. What I have in mind is such turns of phrase as having in mind. We say that we have a certain idea or a certain concept in mind, right? Oh, that isn't what I had in mind, I'm sorry. But where is our mind? How big is your mind, sir? What color is your mind, right? We don't actually conceive of the mind as taking up space or being a thing separate from the body. There's the brain, but we say that the mind, or the soul, or the thing that experiences is something separate from the mind, at least if we buy into Cartesian dualism, which all of us here do. So when we say we have something in mind, we're using an inexact metaphor because we're implying that mind has an inness. But when we're asked strictly, does mind have an inside? Does mind take up space? Of course we say no. Another example would be the turn of phrase to admit of, right? For instance, someone might say, oh, poetry doesn't admit of a definition. And it seems like we're using a very technical, conceptual phrase. It doesn't admit of definition, it doesn't let definition happen to it. Where does admit of really have its root? The word admit, to let into a physical space. So even such seemingly technical and conceptual turns of phrase as admit of are ultimately metaphors, which refer inexactly to the physical world. And this idea that so much of our apparently literal language, in its apparently literal reference to the mental, to the emotional, to the non-physical, in fact refers us ultimately to the physical, is really important for understanding what poetry is. And I'm going to get around to why after just one other observation. And this is the observation that in the 19th century, in the mid 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s, the philosophers Soren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche, the so-called proto-existentialist philosophers, came up with the idea of authenticity. And nowadays we think that being an authentic person is a very important thing. Well, what does it mean to be an authentic individual? The long and short of it, right, is that to be authentic, we have to move beyond the merely sort of societal definition of what we are. So we don't define ourselves by saying, oh, I'm a doctor, I'm someone that cures people, or I'm merely a father. We don't define ourselves only by these relationships or these social roles, but we have a certain individuality, a certain substantive usness that is independent of that. That's what Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Heidegger, who follows on their heels, has in mind when they talk about authenticity. So for Kierkegaard in particular, this moving beyond the social is also a moving beyond the logical, and moving beyond the merely ethical. Kierkegaard conceives of a sphere which he calls the universal sphere or the ethical sphere, which is also the logical sphere. It's the sphere of things that are basically taken as the status quo of what we value. So the status quo would say that to do good is to do what right produces the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people, because that's logical. That would be utilitarianism. Or it might say, what is it to do good? You basically do good unto others as you have them on to do. That's something like a Kantian idea of ethicality. For Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, that is still in a merely ethical sphere, or still in this this status quo of what is logical, what is ethical, what is universal, or what ought to be universal among human beings. For Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, authenticity is beyond that. And to move beyond that sphere is not only to move beyond the merely ethical, to a sort of individually grounded ethics, which is, right, the famous mission of moral philosophy in the 20th century. But it's also to move beyond the linguistic to a new and novel kind of linguistic experience. And it's important to understand this piece comes out in Nietzsche and, interestingly enough, in Foucault, that this moving beyond, this sort of tearing down or destruction, this nihilism, where you take apart the old sphere of what is linguistic, what is morality. That's one project, but we must necessarily put up a new kind of value system. We must make new law tables, as Nietzsche says in Thus Spake Zarathustra. And this is where poetry becomes so important. In the essay on Truth and Lies in an Extramoral Sense, Friedrich Nietzsche talks about this idea that all language, right, the sphere of the linguistic, is purely metaphorical. It's a web of lies, metonyms, and metaphors. And he says we have to tear that down. Throughout the rest of his body of work, he says that's exactly what we have to work to tear down. But in truth, what's interesting about Truth and Lies and Moral Sense is you get a little piece of his positive project really shining through when he says, not only do we have to tear down, but we must adopt a creative attitude. This is also present in The Birth of Tragedy. But there's this idea that we have to create, we have to adopt the creative attitudes that the Greeks famously had. And it's very mysterious and a small part of Nietzsche, this positive project. It's a much bigger part of Martin Heidegger, who famously, and particularly in the essay The Problem Concerning Technology, says that we must fight the reduction to standing reserve, the status quo, the idea that we can measure what is moral by what is pleasant for the greatest number of people. We have to fight that by engaging what he calls poiesis, which is the ancient Greek word for poetic or poetry, and for creation. So Nietzsche and Heidegger tell us that it is the project of the authentic modern man to engage in poiesis, not only to tear down the old way of being, the old sphere of the ethical, universal, and linguistic, but to put up a new one. And that is exactly what poetry does. Poetry uses the language of the status quo in a new and novel way. What good poetry does is it creates new and novel metaphors to replace the old dead metaphors, right? The old dead metaphors, like when we say, this admits of. That's a dead metaphor. The metaphor is to the idea of letting in, but it's become dead for us to the point that we don't think of the novelty of the metaphor through which we're referring the mental or non-physical world to the physical world. Another example would be field of vision, right? You skip through and you pick flowers in a field. That's a metaphor. The field of vision that we actually experience isn't really like that, but when we hear field of vision, we don't think of that metaphorical connection. It is dead to us. What poetry does is it makes new metaphors that foreground that novelty and that newness of the link between the non-physical and the physical. So by creating that new novel link, it at the same time tears down the old way of thinking that link between the medical, or the non-physical and the physical. So poetry is the means by which we accomplish existential authenticity, by tearing down the old and building the new.